This is part 2 of a two-part lecture presented by the ANU Drill Hall Gallery, Paris City of Spectacle. I'm Terence Maloon. Here you see a small painting by Edouard Monet representing the Universal Exhibition of 1867 in Paris. It's handled in a deliberately naive manner. Monet takes pains not to appear slick, not to look like a professional artist. It's clear that figures were incorporated after he'd painted their setting, and that the figures were painted separately from each other without considering their relationship to each other, their relative size, their relationship of scale, which is conspicuously disjointed and garbled. If Monet perceived these mistakes, why didn't he alter them? The jury that selected the paintings for the 1867 Universal Exhibition wanted nothing to do with Monet, of course. Monet had been the focus of scandal in 1863 in the Salon des Refusés with his painting Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, and again in the Salon of 1865 with his Olympia, or as pronounced in French, Olympia. Given the spectacular, scrupulously vetted, highly polished and professionalized, more or less homogeneous character of the salons, the eccentricity of Monet's work and the seeming obscurity and perversity of his intentions stood out from the rest and caused a great hue and cry. Émile Zola, the great novelist, who was a boyhood friend of Paul Cézanne, mounted a courageous defense of Monet in his capacity of journalist and fledgling art critic. And in gratitude, Monet painted this magnificent portrait of Zola. Visitors to the Universal Exhibition of 1867, those who so desired, could see this portrait of Zola, as well as the notorious Déjeuner sur l'herbe and Olympia, because Monet had constructed a pavilion on the periphery of the Champ de Mars, and so also had another controversial French painter, Gustave Courbet. This was how the two most disputed, nonconformist, anti-academic artists protested their exclusion from the main exhibition. It's interesting not only that they found such a conspicuous way of protesting, but they both had the means not to rent, not to borrow a venue, but actually to construct their own private pavilions and to maintain them in a certain style throughout the duration of the Universal Exhibition. This portrait of Zola is as static and formal as a still life. It is a still life, in effect, because all the appurtenances are very deliberately significant. They compose a kind of manifesto of realism. The front cover of Zola's pamphlet, written in defense of Monet, conveys Monet's signature to the painting. The reproduction of Olympia on the wall overlaps a reproduction of a painting by Velázquez, a great forerunner of Monet's realist aesthetic. The Japanese print and gilded screen establish Zola, and by proxy, Monet himself, as a sophisticated aesthete, dandy, and connoisseur of Oriental art. It's a source of wonder to us today that anyone could have been immune to the brilliant tour de force that this portrait of Zola epitomizes. Who could doubt the magnificent talent and the sheer artistry invested in a painting of this caliber? Yet Manet's contemporaries were far from being won over. They found fault with the painting. There was a feature that some found particularly disturbing. It was that the sitter's hand was more emphatic, was more real, as it were, than his face. This slight disparity, which is virtually imperceptible to us today, struck 19th century viewers as a violation of artistic decorum, due perhaps to incompetency or perhaps to some subversive intention. In Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe of 1863, the male figure on the right also has hands that seem more real, more volumetric and weighty than his face, and the spatial plotting has inconsistencies and errors that once struck people as perfectly outrageous, not to mention the subject or the lack of subject, which was goadingly incomprehensible to Monet's contemporaries. Olympia, exhibited in 1865, was clearly a pert little streetwalker, and there was an equivocation in the painting that drove people crazy. She did and she didn't have nipples. She did and she didn't have hair under her arms. People took this ambiguity to be a kind of smutty innuendo, indecent, and equivocation in appalling taste. The world of Émile Zola's fictions overlapped with the realism and also with the sheer artistry of Manet. In 1888, Zola published his novel Nana. It first came out in serial form in a magazine, but when the book appeared, it was printed in an edition of 55,000 copies, and they sold out in a single day. Manet retitled this portrait of the cocotte Henriette Hauser, which you see on the left, which he'd actually painted 3 years earlier. He retitled it Nana as a tribute to Zola's great popular success. Zola's novel is set in the year 1867, the year of the Universal Exhibition in Paris, and the novel opens in the Théâtre des Variétés. There is a tremendous hubbub because a new production is being mounted and a new star is being launched along with it. There are brilliant descriptions of this backstage world and its intrigues. 3 times during the course of the first chapter, Bordenot, the theatre manager, insists that he does not run a theatre but a brothel. The theatre is nothing but a glorified bordel. And in fact, all the women we encounter have names that ring false, stage names, the sort of made-up names adopted by courtesans. Their names are like brand names, and these women are all, in a sense, commodities on the market. Nana, for instance, is only Nana. She has no surname, which we realize is not unusual in the case of loose women in the Parisian demi-monde. To a packed house, the curtain goes up and the production begins. It is a ridiculous kitsch allegory, as if the most embarrassingly awful salon painting had come to life. And the purported star of the production, Nana, is patently terrible. She can't act, she can't sing, people laugh and boo until the climactic moment arrives when Nana appears on stage in the guise of Venus. Venus arrived. A shiver went through the hall. Nana was naked. She was naked with calm effrontery, confident in her all-powerful flesh. A light gauze enveloped her, her round shoulders, her Amazon breasts, whose pink tips were as erect and rigid as lances, her broad hips rolling with voluptuous sway, her plump thighs. All of her body could be guessed at, could be seen beneath the light fabric as white as foam. It was Venus rising from the waves, having only her hair to veil herself. And when Nana lifted her arms, you could see, lit by the footlights, the golden hair of her armpits. There was no applause. Nobody laughed anymore. The faces of men, serious, craned forward, their nostrils contracted, their throats dry and irritable. A breeze seemed to pass through the room, tinged with menace. All at once, from the well-behaved child, a woman had sprung up, disquieting, unleashing the madness of her sex, revealing the unknown depths of desire. Nana continued to smile, but it was now the sharp smile of a man-eater. The photo montage I showed you earlier of the actresses in their dressing room and the gentlemen whose presence they tolerated, even welcomed in their midst, is very much the world Zola depicts. That photo montage, and this one too, comes from an album published in the 1890s, which was quite a production, quite a spectacle, an orama in its own right. In fact, the publication was called Le Panorama, Paris la nuit, the panorama, Paris by night. Essentially, it's a shop window for singers, dancers, actresses, with the implication being that they're all accessible to the men who peruse the album. All of them are on the game. The world of the theatre was indeed a brothel, and the calm effrontery of Nana, confident in her all-powerful flesh, makes us think of Monet's Olympia, of course, noting as well that Zola took pains to show his readers Nana's nipples and underarm hair. The Théâtre des Variétés, where Nana triumphs as the blonde Venus, is adjacent to the Passage des Panoramas, and Zola gives some wonderful descriptions of what the Passage des Panoramas was like in its heyday. Nana has ensnared a respectable married man, an aristocrat, the Count Muffat, as her lover. Zola describes Count Muffat going for a stroll in the Passage des Panoramas. The evening was very mild. A recent downpour had driven an influx of people into the arcade. There was such a crowd hemmed in between the shops that movement was painfully slow. Everything was violently lit. The shop windows were whitened by reflections. There was a trail of dazzlement, white orbs, red lanterns, blue glass shades, ramps of gaslight picking out the outlines of giant clocks and fans, and the gaudiness of the displays, the gold of the jewelers, the cut glass of the confectioners, the pale silks of the dressmakers, all alight behind the sheer glass, caught in the harsh spotlights, while among the disorder and discordancy of the signage, an enormous purple glove appeared from a distance, to be a bleeding hand amputated and then reattached with a yellow cuff. This surreal bleeding hand arises out of the phantasmagoria of a magical new world of mass consumption. Rosalind Williams titled her book about mass consumption in the 19th century France, Greenwalds, and that's exactly what Zola's readers are encountering via his description. Looking back at Zola's world from her vantage point in the late 20th century, Rosalind Williams describes the vision of a seemingly unlimited profusion of available commodities. The characteristics of mass consumption are a radical difference between the activities of production and consumption. The prevalence of standardized merchandise sold in large volume, the ceaseless introduction of new products, widespread reliance on money and credit, and ubiquitous publicity. There is the fabulous prospect of a vast and permanent fair. So there we have a precise description of the world we've come to know, which we've been seeing emerge. The character of Nana wreaks her revenge on men and on the class system and on the world of money. She brings ruin to it all. But it's not so straightforward. Nana herself is terribly damaged. She's very much a victim herself, who brings others down to her own level. She begins her life literally in the gutter. Her rage affecting others in such a disastrous way is also self-directed, self-destructive. Nana's wildness, her perversity, her evil streak corresponds in some way, Zola implies, to the sleazy dream world of the arcades. And I quote, "She adored the Passage des Panoramas. It was a passion carried over from her youth for the gimcrack article made in Paris, fake jewels, gilded zinc, cardboard masquerading as leather. Whenever she came by, she couldn't tear herself away from the displays, just as she had dragged her felt slippers as a young girl, lost in wonderment at the chocolate maker's wares, hearing the organ music wafting from a neighborhood shop with a taste for cheap knickknacks, sewing kits in walnut shells, rag pickers' baskets for toothpicks, Vendôme columns and obelisks holding thermometers. But that evening she was too shaken. She looked without seeing. It annoyed her not to be free, and in her unfocused feeling of revolt, there arose a furious need to do something stupid." Nana is a deeply tragic figure, of course, the very embodiment, the very epitome of commodity fetishism and its bleak complement of nihilism, nullity, wanton waste, futility, the imperative of a dog-eat-dog world. She's the harbinger of ruin and waste, but at the same time, she's an emblem of the culture of sensation and the society of the spectacle. Zola's book likewise created a sensation and unleashed havoc among the reading public, who clamored to lay hands on the copy. And a whole cult, a whole collateral industry sprang up from its notoriety. Monet retitling his portrait of Henriette Hauser, we've already mentioned. Someone had the idea of branding a new line of champagne, capitalizing on the recognition factor and memorableness of the name on everyone's lips. Zola's boyhood friend, Paul Cézanne, perpetuated this in-joke with his painting, presumably conceived as a gift to Zola, purporting to show a flesh and blood Nana who had lent her image to the champagne label. At the close of the century, Paris, the city of light, had become par excellence the city of spectacle. The great poem of display, lauded by Balzac had grown into an epic poem, an odyssey, a paradiso, which also had its purgatory and its inferno if you knew where to look for them. The city's nightlife was famous worldwide. Its display of luxury goods, the lavish way it catered to every type of desire, made it a lodestar for anyone with ambition, with talent, with a scheme in mind, and with money to burn. The sex industry was unbridled. Venereal disease was so rife that an estimated third to a quarter of the male population under the age of 25 were infected, not to mention the prevalence of disease among prostitutes. This painting by Toulouse-Lautrec depicts prostitutes queuing up for a doctor's check for VD. The paintings of Parisian life by Picasso, done soon after his arrival at the turn of the century, show both the dazzlement and the sinister undertow of this perpetual orama of Paris by night. The dream worlds of the arcades and the universal exhibitions were superseded in time by gigantic department stores, and these stores initially patterned themselves both on the arcades and on the pavilions of the universal exhibitions. The prototype for them all was, it seems, the Bazaar Bonne Nouvelle, founded in 1838, which is the subject of a remarkable study by the economist Luc Marco, published in 2009. On the screen, you see the original building designed for André Martin Labbé, a businessman who had made his first fortune through the steel foundries he established in France. Here you have a closer view of the facade. The store was situated on the boulevard Poissonnière, which is in fact a continuation of the boulevard Montmartre, the boulevard you saw represented in Pissarro's paintings in part one. That location was no more than 5 minutes on foot away from the Passage des Panoramas and the Théâtre des Variétés. So it was also close to the Grand Hotels, to the Gare Saint-Lazare, and equidistant from the new train stations still in the planning stages of the Gare du Nord, which opened in 1846, and the Gare de l'Est, which opened in 1849. The Bazaar Bonne Nouvelle incorporated 300 shops, which leased their spaces. It was initially more like an Eastern bazaar or more like the Passage than the kinds of department stores familiar to us today. There was a food market in the basement. Home appliances were sold on the first floor, but the management's ambition for their store to be the #1 orama, a fabulous Parisian spectacle, can be seen blazoned across the facade, which was designed vaguely to resemble a Palladian palace in Italy. In its second incarnation, the architects of the Bazaar Bonne Nouvelle went for the look of a 17th century French chateau. But here you see on the facade signs for a Grand Café, for galleries, and for the mysterious soirees of Monsieur Philippe, whatever they might be. In fact, in the beginning, the Bazaar Bonne Nouvelle contained a diorama. It also contained a theater, and for a while even a circus, plus the cafe, the restaurant, and on the third floor, an art gallery, a gallery that showed works by some of the leading painters of the day, Ingres, Delacroix, landscape painters of the Barbizon School, etc. The Bazaar Bonne Nouvelle didn't entirely occupy the city block or on the Boulevard Poissonnière, but as you can see, that must have been the initial expectation, not realizable in 1838, but possible in the second iteration of the store. And this physical imposition of the street was emulated by the later Grand Magasins, so-called, the true department stores, which began appearing in the 1850s and 60s and grew ever more lavish and spectacular as the 19th century drew to a close. Au Bon Marché, which you see illustrated here, was the first of these, founded in 1852, soon to be followed by Les Magasins du Louvre and La Belle Jardinière. Au Bon Marché exists to this day. It was a whopping success from a trade worth 450,000 francs in 1852. The trade of Au Bon Marché soared to 21 million francs in 1867. The spectacle is capital to such a degree of accumulation that it becomes an image. Thus wrote Guy Debord, whose book, The Society of the Spectacle, published in 1967, is now a classic and is the perfect complement to Walter Benjamin's great Arcades project, not to mention those on-the-spot testimonies offered in the novels by Balzac and Zola, which we've already mentioned. The Society of the Spectacle, Debord's term, that is what we've been seeing emerge, and with it, the language of orama, hyperbole, publicity, promotion, branding. Debord laments, as Balzac and Zola did, the loss of quality so evident at all levels of spectacular language, from the object it praises to the behavior it regulates. And thinking back to Nana, lost in thought in front of the shop windows of the Passage des Panoramas, shouldn't we see this as an allegory of degradation, which is diagnosed as such by Guy Debord? And here to conclude, we see a view over Hong Kong from the Victoria Point, photographed by David Stevenson in 2012, where everything, as far as the eye can see, is financialized. The spectacle is capital to such a degree of accumulation that it becomes an image. Thank you for your interest, and please keep an eye out for other Drill Hole Gallery lectures and for our publications.